right now, there is a microscopic threat out there whose entire evolutionary strategy relies on making you absolutely terrified of a glass of water.
It is
It
wild.
sounds like science fiction, right? But it is happening right now. So today we are taking a deep dive into the bizarre, ruthless, and entirely silent tactics of the diseases trying to break down the fortress of your body.
It really is a fortress.
Yeah, if you picture the human body as this incredibly complex, impenetrable fortress, it's got these massive outer walls, dedicated guards, and an internal communication system that makes, like, our modern internet look completely primitive.
It's a marvel of biological engineering. I mean, truly. But the reality is that fortress is under a constant, relentless siege.
Right.
So we are looking at the science of pathology and etiology today, which is really just the study of diseases and their root causes. But before we get into the actual attackers, we have to establish a crucial framing point brought to us by the World Health Organization.
Okay, what's that?
Well, just because your fortress is still standing doesn't mean it is secure. Health isn't merely the absence of disease. It is a state of complete physical, mental, and social balance.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, being, not sick and being truly healthy are two very different biological states.
I really appreciate that distinction
And
because understanding all of this, it isn't about passing some high school biology test. It's about reading the user manual for your own body.
exactly.
It's learning how to intelligently run this internal ecosystem.
So how do we even begin to categorize the threats to this fortress? I mean, where do we start?
We start by looking at the blueprint. Structural threats generally fall into two main categories. First, you have congenital diseases.
Okay.
These are flaws in the fortress's foundation that exist from birth, like genetic conditions or structural anomalies. The second category is acquired diseases. These are the external attacks or the internal breakdowns that happen over time. And that second category is where the active war is being fought, right? From our sources, it looks like this war is fought on two distinct fronts. The external invaders trying to breach the walls, and the internal rebellions trying to tear the whole thing down from the inside.
Yeah, let's focus on the frontline assault first, the biological infantry. The most prolific of these external soldiers are bacteria, which are microscopic, single-celled living organisms.
Right.
But the most dangerous ones, they don't just march up to the fortress gates, they use vectors.
This completely changed how I view a mosquito bite. Because these bacteria literally use insects as their own personal delivery service to drop them right past our outer defenses, like an Uber for diseases.
It's a highly efficient evolutionary strategy. By hitching a ride directly into the bloodstream via a bite, they completely bypass the skin, which is, our most formidable physical barrier.
Yeah.
But even the bacteria that don't use insects have incredibly destructive mechanics. Take tuberculosis, for example.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because how does a tiny bacteria actually take down a massive vital organ like the human lungs?
It acts like a sapper. When the TB bacteria gets into your lungs, it doesn't just sit there floating around. It actively consumes the lung tissue.
Wait, it eats it?
Yes. It is tunneling through the walls of the fortress, destroying the very architecture of the organ.
But the immune system must notice that happening, right? Do the guards just let it dig?
Oh, the immune system absolutely rushes to the site. But TB is incredibly resilient and difficult to kill. So instead of destroying it, the immune guards shift their strategy to containment.
Okay.
They literally build biological walls around the invading bacteria, creating these hard little prisons in the lungs called tubercles.
Hence the name tuberculosis. That makes so much sense.
Exactly.
And I imagine that constant chronic coughing associated with TB is the lungs' desperate attempt to clear out all that battlefield debris.
Spot on.
But if it's walled off like that, how does a doctor even know it's in there?
They test the memory of your immune guards. In a standard TB skin test, the MAN2 test, a doctor injects a dead, completely harmless protein fragment of the TB bacteria just under your skin.
Oh, so it's like a biological fire drill.
Yes.
They are sounding the alarm to see if the guards recognize the threat without actually starting a fire.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. If the immune system immediately rushes to that injection site and causes a hard swollen welt, it proves the guards have seen this specific enemy before.
Right.
It confirms your fortress has been exposed.
Okay, so TB eats tissue. But for me, the most terrifying bacterial sniper from our research is tetanus.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I always assumed a rusty nail just gave you an infection that spread through your blood.
Hmm.
But if tetanus doesn't actually spread through your bloodstream, how does a cut on my foot end up locking up my jaw?
Tetanus is uniquely terrifying because of its sheer efficiency. The bacteria usually gets in through a deep puncture wound, and you're right, it stays right there in the dirt of the wound.
It just stays there.
Yeah, but it releases a potent neurotoxin that travels up your nervous system, and this toxin has one specific devastating target. It blocks the chemical signal that tells your muscles to relax.
This absolutely blew my mind when I read it. We always think about the brain sending a signal to tell a muscle to flex, but the brain also has to explicitly send a second signal to tell the muscle to stop flexing.
And the tetanus toxin acts like a pair of wire cutters. It severs that second communication line.
So the muscles just contract, and they literally cannot stop.
Right. Which leads to the classic symptom of lockjaw, where the jaw muscle sees completely shut. Left unchecked, it causes agonizing full-body muscle spasms that are actually powerful enough to tear muscles and even break your own bones.
That is horrifying.
It really is. It's why that unified childhood vaccine that protects against tetanus, along with diphtheria and whooping cough, the DPT vaccine, is considered one of our greatest medical triumphs.
It is the absolute worst-case scenario. But, while bacteria are living organisms that we can fight with, things like antibiotics, our sources highlight a much creepier threat.
Viruses.
Right. Invaders that blur the line between biology and chemistry.
Viruses are the ultimate master manipulators, and the most important thing to understand is that they aren't even alive, not in the traditional sense.
Right. If a virus is sitting on a doorknob, it is essentially just a dead fragment of genetic code wrapped in a protein shell.
Exactly.
I like to think of them as a biological USB drive loaded with malicious code. It has no power, it doesn't eat, it doesn't move, it's harmless until it gets plugged in.
But the moment it touches a suitable host cell inside your body, it plugs in and activates. It injects that malicious genetic code into your cell, entirely rewriting the cell's internal instructions.
It just takes over.
Yeah, the virus hijacks the machinery, turning your own cell into a factory whose only job is to print millions of new copies of the virus until the cell literally bursts open and spreads the infection.
They are hijackers.
Yeah.
And none is more insidious than HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. Because HIV doesn't just attack the fortress walls. It goes straight for the generals commanding the defense.
It specifically targets the lymphocytes, which are a critical type of white blood cell. These are the cells responsible for identifying enemies and orchestrating the entire counterattack for the body.
Right.
So by destroying the generals, HIV effectively blinds the immune system. The fortress falls not to HIV itself, but to a common cold or a mild infection that a healthy body would crush in an afternoon.
But wait, if HIV is actively destroying the very cells that are supposed to fight it, and it's hiding inside them, how does a doctor even find it? Finding the virus early on must be like finding a needle in a haystack.
We don't look for the virus, we look for the body's reaction to it. Standard HIV testing, like the ELISA test, searches your blood for the specific antibodies your body creates when it first encounters the virus.
So you aren't looking for the fire, you are looking for the smoke.
Yes, exactly.
If the test finds those specific antibodies, the smoke, it proves the fire is burning somewhere inside the fortress.
It's a brilliantly indirect method of detection, but if we are talking about the sheer terrifying logic of viruses, we have to go back to the hook you started with. Rabies.
Yes. Here is where it gets incredibly dark. Rabies is usually spread by a bite from an infected animal, like a dog or a monkey. And the weirdest, most famous symptom of rabies is hydrophobia, an intense, uncontrollable fear of water.
Right.
I always wondered, why on earth would a microscopic virus care if you drink a glass of water?
It is pure manipulation. The rabies virus doesn't travel through the bloodstream. It slowly crawls up the peripheral nerves inch by inch until it reaches the brain.
That's so creepy.
It is. And once there, it specifically targets the area of the brain that controls swallowing. It actively hijacks the swallowing control center, causing violently painful spasms in the throat muscles the moment the victim even tries to swallow or even looks at water.
But why? What is the evolutionary benefit of terrorizing someone with water?
Because the rabies virus replicates and lives in the victim's saliva.
Okay.
If the victim drinks water, they swallow that saliva. The saliva washes down into the stomach, and the stomach acid melts and destroys the virus.
Oh, wow. So the virus intentionally inflicts terror and physical agony just to prevent the host from clearing their own mouth.
Yes. It makes the victim terrified of water so that the mouth stays constantly foaming and loaded with highly infectious saliva. It turns the host into a biological weapon ready to pass the virus on through a bite.
That is insane.
It is manipulating human behavior to guarantee its own survival.
Thank goodness for Louis Pasteur inventing the rabies vaccine.
Seriously, that is almost too evil to comprehend. It really puts into perspective how vital our vaccines are for these viral hijackers like polio and dengue, too. But so, if viruses are fast and explosive and bacteria are the frontline infantry, what about the slow, silent saboteurs? What happens when a fortress is locked down, but dampness sets in? You get fungi. Fungi act a lot like mold, slowly eating away at the outer walls over time. They don't need an explosive breach. They essentially dine on us, specifically targeting keratin, which is the tough protein that makes up our skin, hair, and nails.
We've all heard of things like athlete's foot or ringworm breaking down the skin. But our sources mentioned a fungus called Aspergillus, and the mechanism here is deeply unsettling.
Because it's not external. If you inhale the microscopic spores of Aspergillus, they settle into the warm, moist environment of your lungs, and they start growing. They spin these biological webs inside the tiny air passages.
It's literally mold growing inside the internal ventilation shafts of the fortress, triggering severe asthma and respiratory failure.
Yeah. And operating in that same stealthy manner are the protozoa. These are single-celled organisms, but they are much more complex than bacteria, and the greatest killer in human history operates in this exact category. Malaria.
Now, we constantly blame the mosquito for malaria, but the mosquito actually isn't the problem, is it?
What's fascinating here is that the mosquito is just the getaway car. The actual killer is a microscopic protozoan called Plasmodium. When the mosquito bites you, it injects this protozoan into your bloodstream. But it doesn't attack immediately.
It waits.
Yeah, it travels straight to the liver, a massive nutrient-rich organ, and goes into hiding.
It's a sleeper cell.
Exactly. While hitting from the immune system in the liver, it multiplies, building an absolute army. Once the army is large enough, they leave the liver and launch a coordinated, massive assault on your red blood cells. They burrow inside the red blood cells, consume them from the inside, and multiply again.
Okay, so this answers a huge question for me, because when you think of a severe illness, you think of a burning fever. But malaria is famous for these violent, freezing, teeth-chattering chills. Why do patients freeze instead of burn?
It comes down to how the red blood cells die. When the protozoan is finished replicating inside the cell, it bursts the cell open. And because they all reproduce at roughly the same rate, millions of red blood cells burst simultaneously. When they explode, they release a highly toxic chemical byproduct called hemazoin into the bloodstream. It's the sudden, massive flood of this toxin that shocks the nervous system, causing those intense, bone-rattling chills.
And all those destroyed, exploded red blood cells have to go somewhere. They end up washing into the spleen, which acts as the body's waste management filter. The spleen gets completely overloaded with the debris and swells up to a dangerous size.
Right, and the deadliest variants even make the infected red blood cells sticky. So instead of just bursting, these cells stick to the walls of tiny blood vessels, completely blocking blood flow to major organs, including the brain. It's a ruthless siege.
So what does this all mean? If these vectors, the mosquitoes and flies, are bypassing our walls and dropping off these deeply complex saboteurs, our best defense strategy isn't necessarily fighting the microbe once it's inside. It's destroying the delivery vehicle.
Absolutely.
If you wipe out the vector, you cut the supply lines, and the fortress stays safe.
Assuming the threat is coming from the outside. But what if the fortress is perfectly sealed? No viruses, no bacteria, no protozoa. What if the internal biology just starts breaking down? This leads us to the second massive category, non-infectious diseases.
The internal collapse. What if the fortress just runs out of rations? If your diet is missing key nutritional building blocks, specific bodily systems simply fail.
We see this with severe vitamin deficiencies. A lack of vitamin A means the light receptors in your eyes physically degrade, causing night blindness. A lack of vitamin D means your body can't absorb calcium, so your bones become soft and literally bend under your own weight, which is rickets.
But the one that really illustrates this concept perfectly is scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency. Think of your individual cells as the bricks that make up the fortress walls. Vitamin C is required to manufacture collagen, and collagen is essentially the biological mortar or cement holding those bricks together.
It is the primary structural protein of all your connective tissue.
So if you stop eating vitamin C, your body stops making that mortar, and the existing mortar begins to dissolve. The fortress literally crumbles. Your gums disintegrate and bleed.
It's awful.
And the most horrifying part, Because scar tissue relies heavily on collagen to hold shut, if you get scurvy old, fully healed wounds from years ago will suddenly unzip and reopen, your
Mm.
body literally forgets how to hold itself together.
It is a stark reminder that our internal biology is entirely dependent on what we take in from our environment. Which brings us to a much darker side of that relationship, environmental poisons.
Oh yeah, the silent killers.
When the environment turns against us, often due to industrial waste, heavy metals contaminate our water and soil, and the human body has no evolutionary mechanism to expel them.
They just build up inside us. Take a heavy metal like cadmium. If cadmium gets into the water supply from industrial runoff, it causes a disease the Japanese originally named Untitled, which translates to ouch, ouch.
And the biological mechanism for that pain is tragic. Cadmium looks chemically very similar to calcium. So when you drink contaminated water, your body accidentally absorbs the cadmium and sends it straight into your skeletal system, thinking it's building strong bones.
But it isn't.
No. Cadmium doesn't provide structural support. It replaces the calcium, making the bones incredibly brittle and causing agonizing joint pain as the skeleton effectively softens.
The body is trying to fortify the walls, but is unknowingly using poison materials. And perhaps the most heartbreaking illustration of environmental poisoning from the research is blue baby syndrome.
Yeah, this occurs when agricultural runoff puts high levels of nitrates into rural drinking water. If that tainted water is used to mix infant formula, it creates a chemical disaster inside the baby's bloodstream.
The nitrates enter the blood and bind directly to the hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin is the molecule inside red blood cells responsible for grabbing oxygen from the lungs and carrying it to the rest of the body.
But the nitrate chemically alters the hemoglobin. It locks it up. The baby is breathing frantically, their lungs are completely full of fresh air, but the blood simply cannot pick up the oxygen.
God, that's terrible.
It is. The baby slowly suffocates from the inside out, and their skin actually turns blue from oxygen starvation.
It's the ultimate betrayal, a broken balance between our biology and our environment. A poisoned well is just as deadly as an invading army. But there's one final scenario we have to cover. The ultimate terrifying question. What if there is no external enemy?
Right.
What if the rations are full, the water is pure, but the fortress's own elite guards stage a mutiny?
Cancer. We often talk about cancer in our daily lives as if it's a pathogen we catch from the outside, but it's not. Cancer is your own cells. It is defined by one catastrophic error uncontrolled cell division.
Explain how that happens, because our cells divide all the time to heal cuts and grow hair. Why does it suddenly become a mutiny?
Because normal, healthy cells have a built-in self-destruct code. It's a biological mechanism called apoptosis. When a cell is old or damaged or has served its purpose, it receives a chemical instruction to quietly dismantle itself and die, making room for fresh, healthy cells.
But cancer cells essentially forget this instruction. The self-destruct button physically breaks. They refuse to die, and instead they just keep multiplying, dividing, and stealing resources and nutrients from the healthy tissue around them.
And we classify the danger of this mutiny by its behavior. If the rogue cells stay in one localized mass, it's a benign tumor. It's a problem, but it's contained to one area.
Right.
But if those rebel cells figure out how to detach from the main group, slip into the bloodstream, and travel to other organs to start new rebellions, that is a malignant tumor. That's when the cancer spreads.
But why do they go rogue in the first place? Why does the self-destruct button break?
That is usually the role of carcinogens. These are mutagens, things like the chemicals found in tobacco smoke or certain types of heavy radiation. They act as the instigators. They physically interact with the cell and literally rewrite its DNA manual, corrupting the code until the cell ignores the rules of the body and goes rogue.
And when a doctor suspects this mutiny is happening, they order a biopsy. They go in and take a tiny tissue sample of the suspected tumor. But what are they actually looking for when they put it under the microscope? Like, how do they interrogate that rebel soldier?
They are looking at the rate of division. By observing the cells, a pathologist can see exactly how mutated they are and how rapidly they are multiplying, which gauges the severity and aggressiveness of the mutiny.
And the stakes of this war, whether from a cellular mutiny, a heavy metal poison, or a viral invasion, reach their absolute peak when the battle lines approach the command center, the brain.
Yes. The brain has its own ultimate vault door called the blood-brain barrier. It's an ultrafine filtration mesh that lets essential nutrients in, but blocks almost all toxins and pathogens from ever reaching the delicate brain tissue. It is an incredible defense mechanism.
But when microscopic invaders do manage to slip past that filter, the results are catastrophic, right?
Yeah.
We hear about brain infections like encephalitis or meningitis being uniquely deadly. But why is an infection in the brain so much worse than an infection in your arm?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it comes down to the simple physics of the human skull. If you get a severe infection in your arm, the tissue inflames and swells up. The skin stretches, it gets red and puffy, but the pressure has somewhere to expand outward.
The arm just gets bigger.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the brain is trapped inside a rigid, unyielding bone box. The skull does not expand. So when an infection causes swelling inside the brain tissue or in the membrane surrounding it, that expanding tissue has absolutely nowhere to go.
So it pushes outward against the skull. And because the skull won't move, it creates massive crushing pressure back inward on the brain itself.
Which is why the hallmark symptoms of a brain infection are so extreme: blinding, agonizing headaches, a rigidly stiff neck, and profound light sensitivity. Once that command center is breached and the physical pressure starts rising, the fortress falls incredibly fast.
Wow. What an unbelievable journey today. From the very beginning of this deep dive, we've looked at the microscopic tactics of the enemies at our gates. We've seen bacteria act as sappers, digging tunnels through our lungs, and neurotoxins acting like wire cutters to lock our muscles.
It's intense.
We've uncovered the terrifying evolutionary mind control of the rabies virus, forcing its victims to fear water to ensure its own spread.
We've explored the silent saboteurs hiding in the liver, the slow dissolving of our biological mortar from malnutrition, the tragedy of poisoned water locking up a baby's oxygen, and finally, the cellular mutiny of cancer.
And the ultimate takeaway here is that understanding all of this, the root causes of how diseases operate, isn't meant to make you paranoid about every surface you touch.
Not at all. It is meant to be empowering. When you understand how the enemy operates, you know how to defend the fortress. It becomes the manual for optimizing your lifestyle, demanding clean water, understanding the value of nutrition, and protecting your environment.
It entirely changes how you view your own biology.
Yeah.
But I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, totally wild thought to mull over. We talked about cancer being this terrifying mutiny where cells forget the command to die and just keep dividing forever.
Right.
They essentially become biologically immortal. They refuse to age and die. So if cancer is our own cells, figuring out the biological cheat code to ignore death, could studying this terrifying mutiny hold the ultimate secret to human longevity?
That is a fascinating question.
What if the key to slowing down or even reversing human aging is hidden inside the genetic code of the very disease we are so desperately trying to cure?